The Freedom Agenda: Why a Balanced Budget Amendment is Necessary to Restore Constitutional Government. By Mike Lee. Narrated by George K. Wilson. Copyright 2011 by Senator Mike Lee. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Regnery Press and was produced in the year 2011 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Introduction. Every day, America comes one step closer to fiscal insolvency. Federal spending has skyrocketed from roughly 2% of GDP 100 years ago to over 25% in 2011, a staggering 1,500% increase in spending as a percentage of GDP. Our national debt now stands at more than $14 trillion, roughly $50,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. And we are adding around $1.65 trillion to that debt every year, about $5,500 per living American. Stated differently, for every family of four, the federal government has already incurred $200,000 in debt and is adding new debt of roughly $22,000 per year. At this rate, we could more than double our debt by 2020. Our annual interest payments alone could then reach nearly $1 trillion, more than we currently spend on national defense, Social Security, and Medicare and Medicaid combined. Meanwhile, our entitlement liabilities will be expanding so fast that mandatory spending, defined as entitlement spending and interest on national debt combined, will likely match or exceed our entire annual budget. Our economy cannot survive this ruinous level of debt, but the federal government is incapable of pulling us back from the brink of a fiscal Armageddon. In its spending mania, it has run roughshod over the careful constitutional checks and balances our founders designed to prevent the emergence of the exact kind of overly powerful spendthrift government we have today. A government that is too powerful and has access to too much money simply can't be relied upon to self-correct. Politicians recognize the problem but are incapable of fixing it. For example, President Obama spoke boldly of the need for spending restraint in his 2011 State of the Union address to Congress. Every day, families sacrifice to live within their means, he declared. They deserve a government that does the same. However, in the very same speech, Obama undermined this message by advocating a host of new federal spending measures, using the euphemism investments to speed up our economic recovery. This was the same argument the president used to justify his exorbitant $800 billion stimulus program. Although that spending binge failed to improve the economy, with unemployment rising from 7.6% when the stimulus passed to roughly 9% today, it looks like Obama's prescription is more of the same. A few weeks after his State of the Union speech, the president proposed a budget with yet another record deficit, one exceeding $1.65 trillion. Unsurprisingly, as I write these words, the federal government hit its debt ceiling, sparking demands from the Obama administration to raise the ceiling even higher. Congress has proven no more responsible than President Obama. For decades, members of Congress have resorted to perpetual deficit spending to keep and expand all the government programs demanded by their influential supporters and other special interests. Due to all this unsustainable spending, eventually the federal government will be forced to either increase taxes or inflate the currency to stave off fiscal insolvency. Either of those moves, which are only short-term fixes anyway, will severely degrade the liberty and prosperity of the taxpayers. Even if Congress and the President somehow agreed on a balanced budget, it would undoubtedly prove to be another short-term fix. History shows there is nothing more impermanent than a balanced budget. For example, look at New Jersey. After taking office in 2010, Governor Chris Christie erased an estimated $11 billion budget deficit almost entirely through spending cuts. Thanks to Christie's policies, by May 2011, New Jersey's economy was turning around, and the state treasurer projected the Garden State would rake in $500 million in extra tax revenue. And what was the reaction of the Democrat-controlled New Jersey legislature? Did its members hail Christie for his fiscal rectitude? Of course not. In fact, they cited the unexpected tax windfall as proof that the state didn't need austerity. The governor has balanced his budgets on the backs of the middle class. Now this gives us an opportunity to undo that, said State Senator Paul Sarlo. Assembly Budget Committee Chairman Lou Greenwald, seemingly rendered incoherent by his dismay at a balanced budget, insisted the extra tax money should be used to restore some of the pain caused by Christie's spending cuts. Eventually, the decision on how to use the extra tax revenue was largely taken out of Christie's hands. The New Jersey Supreme Court, apparently agreeing there was no need for austerity, ordered Christie to increase education funding by $500 million, the same amount as the estimated tax windfall. The trend is the same on the federal level. Congress balanced the budget in the late 1990s, but look where we are now. Far from permanently enshrining responsible spending policies, a balanced budget more often ushers in a new spending spree, as politicians feel absolutely obligated to spend themselves back into deficits. With our government incapable of staving off our looming fiscal doomsday, we have reached the point where we need to adopt a far-reaching structural reform that will provide not a short-term fix, but a long-term solution to the kind of reckless overspending and expansion of federal power that now threaten our republic. While statutory reforms will prove both helpful and necessary, we need something stronger, a permanent mechanism that restricts Congress's spending authority. This book argues that a balanced budget amendment is the solution for extricating America from our fiscal crisis and for limiting the size and scope of government. Conservatives sometimes argue that passing such an amendment, though desirable, is politically impossible. I used to think so myself, and in fact I thought the entire idea of emphasizing constitutional issues to be a losing political platform, until I got elected to the U.S. Senate on just such a platform. Here's how my campaign unfolded. In early 2009, I found myself wondering what would become of the Republican Party and of the conservative cause in general. America had just elected a liberal Democrat to the White House and had increased the Democrats' majorities in both houses of Congress. The Democrats' agenda was clear: more government spending, bigger and more intrusive government, socialized medicine, rising deficits, and a ballooning national debt. Like many Republicans, I blame my own party for much of this disaster. Our national debt had increased more during the 12-year period in which the GOP controlled Congress, including a 6-year stretch in which Republicans also controlled the White House, than it had in any comparable period in history. Despite their small government rhetoric, congressional Republicans during that time had expanded the size, reach, and cost of the federal government and had even nudged America toward nationalized health care, often breaching the constitutional limits on their authority in the process. With this sorry record, Republicans got crushed at the polls in 2008 because they failed to provide a real alternative to the Democratic agenda. In February 2009, I was explaining my frustrations to my friend Monty Bateman, a Utah conservative activist. I told him that the antidote to the perpetual expansion and mission creep of the federal government is found in the enumerated powers doctrine. That is, the notion that the Constitution gives the federal government only limited enumerated powers, while reserving all other powers to the states. This doctrine, I argued, could serve as the basis for a new limited government political movement, one focusing on the Constitution's bedrock, party-neutral principles of federalism. Still, I told Monty that I doubted any candidate could get elected on such a platform. I thought voters would be bored by talk about things like Article 1, Section 8, the part of the Constitution that lists nearly every power possessed by Congress, the 10th Amendment, explaining that powers not granted to Congress in the Constitution are reserved to the states, textualism, a strict literal reading of the Constitution, and originalism, a reading that focuses on the founding generation's understanding of each word and phrase at the time it was added to the Constitution. I was familiar with these topics because my father, the late Rex E. Lee, a professor of constitutional law who served as the U.S. Solicitor General during the Reagan administration, talked about them with me, my brother, and my 5 sisters around the dinner table. I may have been 30 before I realized that not every family discusses the Constitution's presentment clause over mashed potatoes, but I eventually learned through trial and error, mostly error, that people rarely find that document as interesting as I do. After wondering aloud whether my political ideas could resonate with anyone besides lawyers, Monty asked if I would give a speech to some of his friends summarizing my approach. I agreed, and on February 19, 2009, I spoke to a few dozen people at Monty's house. My speech focused on the text and history of the Constitution, and on the founding generation's abiding concern that large national governments tend to become tyrannical unless their power is carefully checked. Local governments, by contrast, tend to operate closer to the people and show more accountability, but they are unable to perform certain national tasks, such as providing for national defense. Consequently, I explain, the Founding Fathers went to great lengths to ensure that while Congress would possess every power necessary to ensure our survival as a nation, all other powers, meaning most powers wielded by government, would remain with the states. I agreed that our government was based on this concept of limited, enumerated powers for nearly 150 years, before that structure began to deteriorate during the New Deal era, especially after the Supreme Court adopted an extraordinarily broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause, one that, taken to its logical extreme, would authorize Congress to regulate every aspect of human existence. I noted that the Supreme Court was never intended to be the sole exclusive guardian of the Constitution, in the sense that officials serving in all 3 branches of government are required to take an oath to uphold it. That requirement, in my view, compels members of Congress to exercise self-restraint in recognition of their limited, enumerated powers. In other words, Congress is not necessarily complying with the letter or spirit of the Constitution just because the Supreme Court has generally allowed it to expand its own powers. At some point during the last several decades, I concluded, Congress stopped asking whether it could exercise almost any power imaginable. Why? Because with only 2 exceptions over the last 75 years, the Supreme Court's answer has always been yes. And when Congress stopped asking the question whether it could expand its power, it also stopped asking whether it should. Thus, our federal government has grown exponentially since the New Deal, and with it, our taxes, our enormous regulatory burden, and our national debt. The solution, I proposed, is for the American people to demand that whenever any member of Congress votes to fund a federal program or create a new one, that person should explain where Congress gets its constitutional authority to run that program. Those who can't supply satisfactory answers should be voted out of office and replaced by candidates who believe the Constitution actually means what it says. As more adherents of the enumerated powers doctrine get elected and those who oppose it lose their seats, Congress will begin to restore meaningful limits on federal power. And as the states regain their lost sovereignty, we will see a dramatic reduction in everything, from massive deficit spending to punitive and confiscatory taxation to oppressive regulation. I was stunned by the reaction to my speech. I had been afraid I would put my audience to sleep, but instead they enthusiastically applauded my remarks, with several people offering to help if I decided to run for federal office. One such person was Connie Smith, a soldier's wife and grandmother, who offered to set up a series of speaking events for me around Utah. She made an argument that I found utterly irrefutable. Regardless of whether you decide to run for office, you will be spreading a message that people need to hear and initiating a statewide, grassroots-level discussion that needs to happen. Over the next few months, I spoke all over the state, in Salt Lake City, Ogden, Provo, Logan, Vernal, St. George, and countless places in between. And on each occasion my listeners reacted as favorably as those in Monty's home. Addressing growing audiences in public libraries, high school gymnasiums, and private residences, I was shocked that so many people in so many communities would show up on a perfectly good Thursday, Friday, or Saturday night just to hear someone talk about the Constitution. At the end of each event, people approached me and asked how they could get involved in promoting the ideas I was championing. By late summer, my speaking events had developed something of an independent following. State legislators and other civic leaders across Utah began offering to organize, publicize, and host my speeches in their own communities. Although the mainstream news media rarely covered my speeches, they drew the attention of bloggers and other elements of the new media. As our nascent, limited government movement gathered supporters and volunteers, we decided to form an organization to serve as a vehicle for the message of constitutionally limited government. We named the organization the Article I Society, recognizing the part of the Constitution that outlines the basic powers that properly belong to the federal government. By November 2009, the Article I Society had signed up hundreds of volunteers from nearly every part of the state. Most of the Society's volunteers, I suspect, were Tea Partiers who already saw that the 2010 election could be a watershed event in American history. Finally, on January 5, 2010, I announced my candidacy for the U.S. Senate. Throughout my campaign, my ideas drew an enthusiastic response from everyday people who understood that our federal government, having shaken off all constitutional restraint, has amassed an unsustainable debt that threatens every man, woman, and child in this country. My message resonated far more thoroughly and effectively than I ever imagined it would. It proved what so many had doubted, that a platform focused on constitutionally limited government can win. Crucially, during my campaign, I frequently championed a balanced budget amendment. It seemed many voters hadn't given the issue much thought, so I explained why this single reform is the linchpin both for restoring constitutional limits on federal power and for resolving our fiscal crisis. Once the issue was framed in this way, I found my listeners overwhelmingly supported the idea. I quickly concluded that a balanced budget amendment is indeed possible, and that the biggest obstacle to adopting it is the simple perception that it can't be done. In order to begin changing that perception, I decided the American people could use a clear, concise argument for why a balanced budget amendment is so important, how it can help restore constitutionally limited government, and how it can get adopted. And that's what this book sets out to explain. Part 1 of the Freedom Agenda outlines the enumerated powers doctrine, the notion that the Constitution created a federal government authorized to wield only limited enumerated powers. It also details why the Founding Fathers were so committed to constitutionally limited government, how we have drifted from it, and the preliminary steps we can take to restore it. Part 2 argues that the only reliable way to permanently balance the budget is by adopting a balanced budget amendment, and explains how balancing the budget will help to restore constitutionally limited government. Part 3 describes how, just as efforts to balance the budget will help to restore constitutionally limited government, so too will efforts to restore constitutionally limited government help us to balance the budget. Part 4 provides some crucial documents that listeners will find useful in our struggle to restore limited government as envisioned by America's founders. Whether you are most concerned about improving our economy, shoring up our national defense, or preserving entitlements like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, you should support a balanced budget amendment. After all, our economy, national defense, and entitlements are all jeopardized by our crushing national debt. For this reason, the debt crisis is neither a conservative nor a liberal issue. It is neither Republican nor Democratic. It is simply an American issue. Saddling our children and grandchildren with this debt is unconscionable. But it would be foolish to think our overspending will only affect future generations. This is an existential crisis that, if left unresolved, will dramatically impact our lives in the near future. We can still fix the problem, but the clock is ticking. The time to act is now, for our children's sake as well as our own. Part 1. The Case for Constitutionally Limited Government. Chapter 1. Liberty and Government Action, a Zero-Sum Game. Like good neighbors, good governments know and respect boundaries. Similarly, bad governments, like bad neighbors, fail to recognize any meaningful difference between their own business and the business of others. But unlike bad neighbors, bad governments have certain tools that, if abused, can destroy not just the tranquility of a neighborhood, but the freedom, prosperity, and survival of an entire nation. Government should therefore be subject to defined boundaries that, like a fence that defines the boundaries between two neighboring landowners, mark the limits of their power. America's founding fathers understood this principle, having suffered the abuses of a London-based government that had access to vast, seemingly limitless resources, and recognized no real limits on its power. Accordingly, the founders carefully crafted the fundamental document of our republic, the U.S. Constitution, to limit the role of the federal government to a few limited or enumerated powers needed to fulfill national responsibilities. These powers included regulating commerce between the states and with foreign nations, establishing an army and a navy, and otherwise providing for national defense, declaring war, establishing a uniform system of weights and measures, and protecting intellectual property. Crucially, the founders specified that powers not granted to the federal government would be reserved to the states. We have drifted far from that understanding in recent decades, largely because the Supreme Court rarely enforces limits on Congress's authority. Congress has interpreted the court's inaction as a constitutional green light for constantly expanding its own power. Thus, members of Congress routinely assume that any and every problem can and should be addressed at the national level, regardless of any constitutional restraints. When members of Congress are occasionally forced to cite their authority for adopting some measure, they typically cite Supreme Court precedents that imply Congress is empowered to regulate nearly every aspect of human existence. Today, the fight for a balanced budget amendment is part of a larger battle to restore constitutionally limited government, a system in which, as James Madison explained in Federalist No. 45, the powers of the federal government are few and defined, while those reserved to the states are numerous and indefinite. This governing structure is rooted in the ancient unassailable notion that liberty is preferable to tyranny. The founding generation understood that the former is more likely to exist and to give rise to its principal byproduct, prosperity, where the power of government is limited. It is up to our generation to restore the founders' vision. To understand why the founding generation insisted so adamantly on constitutionally limited government, we must first understand the delicate relationship between liberty and government action. Liberty is the ability of each individual to live, act, and enjoy his own property without external coercion, interference, or control. In other words, it is the capacity to live and act affirmatively rather than being acted upon. Liberty is a gift from God. It exists without any earthly sovereign bestowing it upon us, and will remain with us unless or until an external coercive force takes it away, by, for example, threatening our lives or degrading our property rights. The purpose of government is to constrain human behavior through coercion. Therefore, when government acts, it does so at the expense of individual liberty. In fact, government action and individual liberty can fairly be described as competitors in a zero-sum game. To whatever degree a government acts, individual liberty is diminished to that extent. That doesn't mean all government action is bad. In many instances, we need the government to act to protect a person's life, liberty, or property against potential threats from others. Without government, we would live in anarchy, an awful condition in which the protection of life, liberty, and property would be left to each family or individual. In such a state, weaker individuals would be at the mercy of the aggressive and the strong. Accordingly, there are instances when we must sacrifice a degree of individual liberty in order to authorize government action that, on balance, tends to enhance each individual's personal security, liberty, and property interests. While normally focused on protecting life, liberty, and property, government action may be warranted in some circumstances, primarily at the state and local level, where the government in question is tasked with establishing essential infrastructure that, while benefiting the public at large, probably would not exist without government involvement. Examples of such infrastructure include public roads, public schools, and public parks, all of which are normally administered at the state and local level. Essential infrastructure aside, however, government action should normally be limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property. Every law and government action should be examined with those objectives in mind. Consider laws against theft. Let's say I stole something from my friend Fred Roberts. Because of anti-theft laws, if I swiped something from Fred, especially something valuable like his diamond-studded pinky ring, I would expect to 1. Get arrested. While charitable souls, Fred and his wife Penny are firm believers in the rule of law and would immediately call the police. 2. Be prosecuted, convicted, and punished with a severe fine and or prison sentence. These consequences would dissuade me from stealing from Fred. Anti-theft laws can therefore be said to restrict my liberty, but I don't mind because, at least for me, foregoing theft is like foregoing the right to eat dirt or shards of glass. It is far from a sacrifice. I firmly believe in that old-fashioned Judeo-Christian tenet that stealing is wrong and
Sample complete. Ready to continue?